Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Now, most of you already know me, but for those few of you who don't, my name is Jody Bloom. I studied archaeology of ancient civilizations as a BA and went on to do a master's degree in Assyriology, which is archaeology of ancient Mesopotamia. At the minute, my professional work is based on archaeology in the UK, but I'm still really passionate about the ancient civilizations I studied during my degrees, and especially how our knowledge of these civilizations can enhance our understanding of the Bible. So I'm really excited to be able to share some of what I know with you guys. But before we jump straight into biblical archaeology, I think it's important for you to understand what archaeology is as a discipline. So, let me throw this question out to you guys. What is archaeology? I like that. Study of old stuff. Does anyone want to add to that? Digging. Excellent. Anything else? Yeah. Get it. You do get blisters while digging. Yes, that is true. Yep. I like that. Study of old civilizations. Yep. Study of history. Okay, great answers. Yes, so archaeology is basically the study of the ancient and recent human past through material remains. And by material remains, oops, I've just given it away. By material remains, we just mean things like buildings, burials, food, pottery, tools, and to be honest, any other artifacts that might be left over from previous societies. What I should mention though is archaeologists do not dig dinosaurs. Just for the record, that's paleontology. There are two things I think are important for you to know about archaeology. So, firstly, excavations we carry out as part of our research are irreversible and essentially destructive. And that's really important to remember because when you're excavating an area, you're removing the soil. And once you do that, the context of the object or feature is destroyed. Which means if a particular site has been excavated, you can't go back 5 years later and re excavate the same area. The process is irreversible. So it's really important that we carefully record all the information and preserve the artifacts because that's what's going to survive in future. And secondly, archaeology relies on interpretation. And this is something that right at the start of my first year of university, I remember my lecturers were hammering into us. We weren't there, we didn't physically see what happened, so we have to rely on what evidence we have to interpret an artifact or a site. And sometimes interpretations change, and as we continue to excavate, our knowledge and our understanding grows. And sometimes previous theories end up being altered or even dismissed altogether. So the more evidence we have, the more confident we can be about our conclusions. And I think that's important to remember because I often hear people say that archaeology proves the Bible. And personally, I'm always hesitant to use the word prove because it suggests that you have 100% of the evidence and there's no room for doubt or differences in opinion. But Ellen White makes an interesting point in The Great Controversy. She says, while God has given ample evidence for faith, he will never remove all excuse for unbelief. All who look for hooks to hang their doubts upon will find them, and those who refuse to accept and obey God's word until every objection has been removed and there is no longer an opportunity for doubt will never come to the light. So because of the nature of archaeology, there's always going to be room for unbelief. But notice again what she says in the first line. What does she say God has given us? Exactly. God has given us ample evidence for faith. And that is what archaeology does as well. While it can't prove without a shadow of a doubt that the Bible is inspired by God, I do believe it gives us ample evidence to demonstrate the validity and the trustworthiness of Scripture. So, let's move on to today's topic. This afternoon, we're going to look at Assyria and, in particular, its impact on a Judean site called Tel Lachish, sometimes known as Lachish. Now, one of the earliest excavators of Assyria was an archaeologist by the name of Austin Henry Layard. Layard really wanted to find Nineveh. He excavated at a few different sites, and at one of them he thought he'd actually found Nineveh, only to later realize it wasn't Nineveh. But some years later, in 1849, a farmer had been ploughing in his field and he found something. So he sent word to this archaeologist, Layard, and he quickly went over to the farmer's field, and there he found an inscription. He started to realize that this was potentially a very exciting site. So he brought all his men together. He had about 200 men, and within 24 hours, he uncovered parts of two major palaces. Now, today we're a lot more meticulous and systematic in our excavations than they used to be. They were a little bit like human bulldozers, so they managed to uncover the archaeology pretty quickly. One of the palaces that was discovered was the palace of a king called Sennacherib. It's often termed the palace without rival. So here we see where Nineveh is. It's located on the Tigris River in Upper Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq. We see an artist's depiction of the entranceway into the palace. You can see at either side there are these two statues here. They're called lamassu. They're composite figures of bulls with wings and a human head, and these are deities. They're protective figures which guard the entrance. And here's a plan of the palace. You see it's a pretty substantial building. You've got X1X in the middle here. That's the courtyard. And as Layard excavated, he discovered this room. They think this room is probably the throne room of the king. And as they were digging, they found some palace reliefs. What's interesting about these reliefs was that it told the story of the Assyrian king, Sennacherib, besieging a city called Lachish. Now, Lachish is actually mentioned in the Bible. It's mentioned a few times in the books of Joshua, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, Nehemiah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Micah. Originally, this city had Canaanite occupation, and we see this even in the Bible. The first time it's mentioned is in Joshua chapter 10, verses 3 and 4. It says, "Therefore, Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, sent to Hoham, king of Hebron, Piram, king of Jarmuth, Japhia, king of Lachish, and Debir, king of Eglon, saying, Come up to me and help me, that we may attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the children of Israel." So here we see the Canaanite king of Jerusalem is sending a message to these other kings, the king of Hebron, Jarmuth, Eglon, and the king of Lachish. The city is mentioned again just a few verses later. Then Joshua passed from Libnah, and all Israel with him, to Lachish, and they encamped against it and fought against it. And the Lord delivered Lachish into the hand of Israel. So the Bible describes how the city was initially Canaanite, but after the conquest was occupied by the Israelites. Here's a more detailed plan of the probable throne room in Sennacherib's palace. You can see that the wall reliefs actually told a story, almost like a comic strip of how Sennacherib defeated Lachish. So, on the left, it starts with the attacking infantry. Then you see the Assyrian army storming the city. They take the men, women, and children to deport them as captives. And then you see this imposing image of Sennacherib seated on his throne. These palace reliefs are actually currently housed in London at the British Museum. Has anyone not been to the British Museum before? Okay, that's a shame. Um, if you haven't been before, I highly recommend it. There are some amazing artifacts at the museum. Sometimes it feels like my second home. So there are 12 reliefs, and this is one of them. This is the section that depicts the actual siege of the city. So you can see these structures here. Does anyone know what they are? Any ideas? Ashley, you're not allowed to answer. Interesting. They're siege engines, yeah, or battering rams. And the purpose of these machines were to batter down the walls of the city. And in order to do that, they've created these ramps. See here going up. Where they've gathered lots of stone and debris, and they've put wooden planks on top so they can move the siege engine. And how about these things? Any idea what these are? Any guesses? Rockets, okay. So they're actually firebrands. So the people inside the city are throwing firebrands over the walls in an attempt to burn and destroy the Assyrian army. Here on the left, you can see the siege engine. On the right, sorry. You can see the siege engine again. But does anyone want to guess what these spoon-like objects are? They're actually ladles containing water, and the soldiers would throw them on the siege engines to make sure they didn't burn from all the fire that was being thrown from outside the city. On the left, you see the archers. They would have made up part of the army, shooting the arrows. And here on the left, you have slingers. Now, when you think of a sling stone, what story in the Bible comes to mind? Yeah, David and Goliath. Now, how many of you, when you've heard the story, imagine David with a small stone, with maybe like a Dennis the Menace slingshot? Yeah, that's the image that's often depicted, right? But actually, slingers were a proper part of the Assyrian army, and sling stones were deadly weapons. They were about the size of a cricket ball, and they weighed about a pound to a pound and a half. They could be flung 120 yards at about 120 miles per hour. So these were deadly weapons. We also see on the left what happened to the local officials who organised resistance against the Assyrian Empire. The wall reliefs depict these officials being impaled on wooden stakes. So this is what the Assyrians did to their enemies. And you might think that's bad, and it is, but they also depicted this, which are people being flayed. And so you can understand that the Assyrian army were pretty ruthless. And if I asked you now to go and preach to these guys, how would you feel? You can kind of understand now why Jonah might have been somewhat resistant to go to Nineveh and to preach to these people. On these panels, you see the Assyrian army have finally managed to besiege the city, and the men, women, and children are being taken captive. Their hands are bound, and at the bottom, just on the right, is King Sennacherib, seated on his throne, larger than life. He's the biggest figure on these palace reliefs, and the captives are bowing down and paying him homage. There's an inscription just above his throne, written in Akkadian cuneiform, which says, "Sennacherib, king of the world, king of Assyria, set up a throne, and the booty of Lachish passed before him." So these are the scenes that Sennacherib had on the walls of his palace, possibly even in his throne room. This is what he boasted about. and it highlights the fact that this event was very important to the Assyrian king. Now, like in any other discipline, the more evidence you have, the better a picture you can create. And it's interesting that not only do we have the palace reliefs that depict the event, but we also have Sennacherib's Annals, which talk about his campaign. So this is the Taylor prism. It's a hexagonal prism made of clay. The inscription is written in Akkadian cuneiform, and in it, Sennacherib boasts of several military campaigns. It's currently in the British Museum, so next time you go, look out for this as well. Now, the way Sennacherib talks about his defeat of the different cities is interesting. He describes his campaigns into Lower Mesopotamia, Ashkelon, Ekron, and many other places, and he often uses phrases like this. I surrounded, I conquered their spoil, I carried off, and their small cities, which were numberless, I destroyed, I devastated, I turned into ruins. I besieged, I captured, I destroyed, I devastated, I burnt with fire. So clearly he's boasting about his military accomplishments. Now there are 8 different campaigns that the Taylor Prism records, but the most interesting one for us is actually his 3rd campaign, because this specifically mentions the tribute that he imposed on a Judean king called Hezekiah. If we look at the text, we have the Akkadian on the left, and the translation, luckily, on the right. And from line 18, it reads, As for Hezekiah, the Jew, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong walled cities, as well as the small cities in their neighbourhood, which were without number, by levelling with battering rams, and by bringing up siege engines, by attacking and storming on foot, by mines, tunnels, and breaches, I besieged and took those cities. 200,150 people, great and small, male and female, horses, mules, asses, camels, cattle, and sheep without number, I brought away from them and counted as spoil. Himself, like a caged bird, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city. Now, there are a few interesting things about this text. Firstly, it talks about him conquering 46 strong walled cities. Even though he doesn't specifically mention Lachish, we know from his palace reliefs that Lachish was included in those walled cities. Also the fact that this text mentions Hezekiah by name is amazing extra biblical evidence for the historicity of this biblical king. But the last thing that's interesting is almost what Sennacherib doesn't say, because we've just looked at the phrases he used, emphasizing how he'd destroyed cities and razed them to the ground, but when he comes to Jerusalem, he says something different. He simply says that he shut up Hezekiah in Jerusalem, his royal city. And we might wonder why he doesn't say the same thing about Jerusalem. It seems a little unusual, but the Bible gives an interesting insight. The Assyrian king is first mentioned in the book of 2 Kings chapter 18. From verse 13 it reads, And in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. Then Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong. Turn away from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will pay. And the king of Assyria assessed Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. So Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house. At that time Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the pillars which Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. So here Sennacherib has already come up against the fortified cities of Judah. He's now at Lachish, and King Hezekiah decides to pay him tribute. But then we read later in the chapter how Sennacherib sends an official, the Rabshakeh, to Jerusalem to try and convince the city to surrender. And this is what the official says to the Israelites. But do not listen to Hezekiah, lest he persuade you, saying, The Lord will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nations at all delivered its land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Shepharvaim and Hena and Iva? Indeed, have they delivered Samaria from my hand? Who among all the gods of the lands have delivered their countries from my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem from my hand? And you can hear the confidence and the pride of the Assyrian king. How many of the other gods had saved their cities? None. Sennacherib had destroyed them all. And he basically asks, why do you think your God is any different? But we read on and see what happens to the Assyrian army. And it came to pass on a certain night that the angel of the Lord went out and killed in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when people arose early in the morning, there were the corpses all dead. So Sennacherib king of Assyria departed and went away, returned home, and remained at Nineveh. Now, ancient civilizations like Assyria and Egypt usually didn't boast about their losses. Sennacherib wanted to defeat Jerusalem, but it makes sense that the reason his palace was adorned with pictures of a siege at Lachish and not Jerusalem was because he wasn't successful in his goal. And it's amazing that we've got the biblical text describing Sennacherib's campaign in Judah. We have the palace reliefs that tell the story, and we've got the textual evidence from the Taylor PRISM. But as well as all this, we've actually got the site itself. So on the right, you see an aerial picture of the site, Lachish. And Tel Lachish has actually been excavated by 4 different teams. It was initially excavated in 1932, and the last excavations finished only a couple of years ago. The last excavations were carried out by the Hebrew University and Southern Adventist University. Now, I had the privilege of actually being at the excavation in 2016. I went over to Israel and I joined the team, and it was amazing because I'd grown up going to the British Museum and seeing the palace reliefs. So to actually be at the site that you'd seen thousands of times in depictions, it was just incredible. This is where Lachish is located. It's not far from Jerusalem, it's only a couple of days' walk away, and it was actually the second most important city after Jerusalem at the time of Hezekiah. Here's an artist's reconstruction of what they think the city would have looked like. And what's really interesting is that many of the artifacts found at the site during the excavations match with what's depicted on the palace reliefs. So here we have the archers again, and as the archaeologists were digging, they found hundreds of arrowheads at the site. In total, just over 850 arrowheads were discovered, artifacts that the Assyrians used when attacking the Israelites. There's one bone arrow head in the middle. They actually found 16 of them, and they think that when the army ran out of normal arrows, they kind of improvised and created bone ones instead. Here are some more archers, but if you look closely, you can kind of see that the front one is wearing armor. And the team found many pieces of these iron scales from the Assyrian armor at the site. They uncovered more than 15 sling stones. Like we said before, these were most definitely not pebbles. Now, how many of you would like to be hit by one of those? No. They also found this during the British excavations, and at first they weren't quite sure what it was. And in fact, I remember when I went there, I saw the same thing. This is my picture. It was taken on my phone, so it's not the best quality. But I remember looking at it and thinking, okay, it's a pile of rubble. I'd assumed that maybe it was part of a wall that had collapsed. But actually, one of the staff explained to us that this was, in fact, the remains of the Assyrian siege ramp that they'd used when attacking the fortifications of the city. They used hundreds of tons of material to build up this siege ramp. And this is the oldest siege ramp from the biblical period found. There is a siege ramp at Masada, which the Romans built around 73 AD, but the one at Lachish is obviously much older, so it's very significant. Here's another illustration, and I've highlighted where the siege ramps would have been located. And in fact, the one on the right is the one that I showed you a photograph of that still survives. Now, the Assyrians also burnt the city when they besieged it, and we found evidence of this. If you look at the bottom, there's actually a burnt layer. You can see the dark ashy material at the base. You can even see the mud bricks if you look closely. The mud bricks have hardened during the burning, and you can see how they've fallen in as well. During the recent excavations in 2014 by the Hebrew University and Southern Adventist University, they discovered an interesting artifact. It was this little dipper juglet. Now, it's always very exciting when you find pottery that's intact, because usually we find it in pieces. But this was discovered intact, lying on its side, and when they emptied the contents of the jar, they found an impression of a seal. Not the animal, but the object. So here are some examples of seals. They can come in various shapes and sizes. The long, thin ones are called cylinder seals. And the other types are called stamp seals. And you can see the modern impression next to them. Seals were usually made from stone, and as you can see, the type of stone could vary greatly. They would sometimes contain the name of the owner, and it was used in a couple of different ways. Firstly, to secure what you owned. For example, if you had an object that you didn't want tampering with, maybe a confidential papyrus document, you'd roll up the papyrus and tie it with string, and then you'd place a little ball of clay onto the string, and you'd press your seal into the clay and let it dry. And that way, if it was broken, you knew it had been tampered with. You could also roll or impress it into into documents made from clay, and that would act a little bit like a signature. So they were really very personal items and markers of authority. And so the team found this seal impression. So not the actual seal itself, but the impression that had been made in the clay. The technical term for it is BULLAE or BULLAE in plural. And they found this in the dipper juglet. Obviously, they were very excited. So they decided to do some more careful excavation around the jug to see if there were any more. And as they were excavating, they would sift the soil around the area just in case they'd missed anything. And as they sifted the soil, they found a couple more seal impressions. They then sent more soil to Jerusalem to be wet sieved, because sometimes even when you're dry sifting soil, small objects might be covered in mud, they might just look like stones. So wet sifting using water is great because it helps uncover artifacts which you might not usually notice. And as they did that, they found a fourth impression. These are the 4 seal impressions, or BULLAE, that were discovered at the site. And you've got the drawing of them on the right. One of them is particularly interesting because it mentions someone from the Bible. Isaiah chapter 37 verses 1 and 2. And so it was, when King Hezekiah heard it, that he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord. Then he sent Eliakim, who was over their household, Shebna the scribe, and the elders of the priests, covered with sackcloth, to Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos. This passage mentions an individual called Eliakim. and on the BULLAE, one of the BULLAE that they'd found actually contained the name Eliakim on it. So it's very interesting. They've actually found the seal impression of an official of King Hezekiah. But perhaps even more exciting was a seal impression that was discovered in 2015 during excavations in Jerusalem, led by Elliot Mazar, and it was this: Hezekiah's seal impression. So not only do we have BULLAE from Hezekiah's official, but we even have one from the king himself. You can see the iconography that would have been engraved into the seal in reverse that's been impressed clearly into the clay. The image is interesting actually. It's kind of an Egyptian motif. There's a two-winged sun disk in the middle, and which is flanked by an ankh on the right, just here, which is a hieroglyphic symbol meaning life. And it's interesting that it uses Egyptian iconography. But there's also writing on the impression, and it says, belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. Now, there had already been a couple of these seal impressions found before, but they'd been found on the antiquities market. So they didn't come from a secure context, and people weren't really sure if they were real or forgeries. But this seal impression was found during an excavation in a secure 8th century context, so we know this artifact is genuine. But there was a third BULLAE discovered, again in Jerusalem, by Elliot Mazar. Arguably, maybe this is even more exciting than the king's. They actually found the seal impression of Isaiah. Now, unfortunately, the upper part of the BULLAE is damaged and missing, but the inscription is still quite clear, and it reads, belonging to Isaiah. And then it has the Hebrew letters NVY at the end. Now, in ancient Hebrew, there aren't actually any vowels, but it's likely the Hebrew word Navi, which means prophet, belonging to Isaiah the prophet. And this makes sense because Isaiah was, of course, a contemporary of Hezekiah, and he was the prophet who told King Hezekiah not to be afraid when Sennacherib was trying to invade Jerusalem. And I think this may be the first time we have an artifact relating to a major prophet in the Bible. And so, if we go back to the verse we read a while ago, there are a few different individuals mentioned, right? There's King Hezekiah, there's Eliakim, and there's Isaiah. And we have seal impressions from all three individuals. And so, when you look at the city of Lachish, it's actually a pretty unique city. Not only do we have the palace reliefs, but we also have the textual evidence. We have the site itself, and we have the seal impression of a person mentioned in the Bible. And of course, we also have the biblical account. It's very rare that we get this much evidence for a place mentioned in the Bible. So it's a very exciting site, and I want to thank you for listening.